completion of that season. Now today, if you were with us in spring, you were involved in a series called Stories of Transformation, where we heard from different people who are part of Neighborhood Church about how Jesus has transformed their lives. One person that wasn't able to fit into that block of stories of transformation, and also we want to do these stories along the way, is Millie Frazier. So Millie, come on out here. She's back here. And so Millie, come on up. So Millie has been a part of Neighborhood Church for a little over a year. And Millie is 83 years old. So she's been around for a little while. I was trying to do the math. So is it 1940 you were born in? 1940 she was born in. And so for those kids who have been born on the other side of this millennium, you know, we have to learn from wisdom and age along the way. But Millie has an amazing story. And as you listen to her talk today, I want you to hear God's faithfulness. Not just in a moment, but through all of life. That God is at work. God is doing something, even if it doesn't seem like it. And I believe that you're going to hear much of different things. Also, I recognize that when she sits down, some of you over here might not be able to see Millie's face quite as good. That's okay. Feel free to move over here, you know, instead of just being annoyed that you can't see her face. She's got some great notes for what she's going to talk about. Also, she has her cheering section over here of of her different children, and you can feel free to introduce all of them because I'm not going to get all their names right. Yeah, all right. So I'm going to just get Millie started here, and we're going to just jump right in. So Millie, feel free to share your story with us, and I'll try to interject along the way here. So tell us a bit about where you've come from, how you grew up, and then how you came to know your husband Larry and get married, and then this journey even all the way up to living at Asbury around the corner here. So feel free to go, Millie.
Okay. And welcome. I'm glad that...
Take the mic up.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
Not a problem. I'm just here to help.
Yes, this is out of my comfort zone, definitely. But nonetheless, it's hard when you have a story of God's faithfulness and how much He loves you. It's hard sometimes not to share. And so, like I say, I'll do the best I can. And if anywhere along the line you have questions, all I can say is ask. I do pray that you will hear the words of the Lord through me, that it's really not mine, but it's God's story to tell. I grew up in a big house in Overlea, Baltimore, Maryland, and it was a big single home with my mother, my father, my older sister, and my great-grandfather, who was 95 when he died, and an Uncle Joe, who was never married. And because my grandparents were close by, both my mother's parents and my father's, I had lots of uncles and aunts and cousins that were always together sharing fun. So I just remember that it was a good time for me as a child. I always believed in God, and I believed that He loved me. Now, my mother grew up being a caregiver because my grandmother was sick. And mother had to quit school when she was going into the 9th grade, I believe, because she had to take care of older brothers and younger sisters. So Mom grew up as a caregiver. She was full of fun. She was loving. She was definitely a big hugger, and bear huggers. So you knew that you were welcome when you came to the house, and she was always willing to have an extra plate at the table. Gift of hospitality was definitely hers. Lots of love. Now, my father was a German Lutheran, and if you remember, a lot of folks, I saw that. Somebody else evidently's heritage from German Lutheran. And so he was a bit on the stoic side. He was also very loving, but you saw it in actions in body language more than you did in the words, because his philosophy was always, if something goes wrong, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and keep it going. Don't turn back, just keep going forward. And I do believe that's where I have all my perfectionistic traits now, because Dad was pretty much on the straight and narrow with many things. He didn't see much gray. Now, because Mom was a Methodist, Dad, of course, joined the Methodist Church. And so my sister and I grew up at Gatch Memorial Methodist Church in Baltimore, and we did all of the normal things that you do when you're young people, like the kids here going down for Sunday school. My sister and I learned to say Bible verses so we could win the little bookmarks to put in our Bibles, vacation Bible school, church dinners, all those sort of things were a part of our life. I know that I felt that we were Christians, but I don't guess we ever really, in many ways, it was talked about much, even in the church, because back then, it would have been in the 50s, and the Methodist Church was moving more from, I guess, in many ways, evangelism to social justice. And so some of the preaching was not strong like it should have been, and you'll hear more about that from me later. But anyhow, music, though, was always a big part of who I am. And the church hymns, the old ones, are the ones that I grew up. Jesus Loves Me, The Old Rugged Cross, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. They were many of the hymns, and even Onward Christian Soldiers, as Susan just told you about. They were always a part of my life. I have to take a sideline here and say, I sang all the songs. The words I knew, but I blew them up here. I didn't really understand what the words were saying until after I was saved. So if you're like that sometimes and you just are singing out of rote, stop and think of the words. I was baptized when I was an infant, and when I was 12 years old, I did the normal thing then and joined the confirmation class. And so I was taken into membership in the United Methodist Church. That would have been when I said my first yes to Jesus, like these light boxes. Again, it was in my head. I don't remember hearing anything about relationships with Jesus or anything about being saved. In fact, when I eventually told my mother that I was saved, she wanted to know what I was saved from. She had no understanding, but I can say she did before she died. My teen years were pretty much uneventful. I was trying to learn who I was and what I wanted to be. I definitely wanted to be a wife and a mommy. That was probably most and foremost. But since my father was the oldest of four, and in those days there was no money for college, Dad did not have that opportunity. And my mother, being a caregiver, having quit school, she, of course, did not have anything after into high school. So Dad kind of encouraged my sister and I that we needed something beyond high school. Else went to college and became a teacher. And because I enjoyed being a nurse's aide, we called him a pinky back in the 50s. I had a pink little uniform. And I enjoyed that, so Dad kind of headed me in the direction of nurses training. So that's kind of where I was at the end of around the time, I guess I'd say, graduated from high school and moved in those directions. And again, a side note, back then, children did what their parents told them to do. And so it wasn't often that we would rebel.
What a great time. What a great time. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Nami's cringing.
My kids are holding their heads down. No.
Yep. So about the time I was 15 was when I met Larry, and he and I had other plans. He had come to a dance with a friend to meet someone else, not me. But he said when he saw me, he told his friend, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." And his friend just laughed out loud. He said, "No way, that will never happen. You don't even know her." Nonetheless, we did dance a few times, and we did date after that a few times. But I broke the relationship off because I did not have the same feelings at that point in life that he did. But then because I had went to an all-girls high school in Baltimore, if I wanted to go to my junior prom, I had to ask the guy.
That's pretty progressive.
Yes. And so my girlfriends convinced me that I needed to swallow my pride and call Larry. So after some convincing, because yes, I did not want to stay home, I called him, and he immediately said yes. In hindsight, he told me that his plan was to date me a few times and then say goodbye to me, as he felt I had done to him. But needless to say, it didn't happen that way, because he had said as soon as he had seen me that night, he knew that he had loved me and I would be his wife. And I can agree that from that day on, I knew Larry was the one for me. So nonetheless, I went on into nurses training after high school, and Larry was in an apprenticeship to be a machinist, and so he went in that direction, but we dated all along. And then we let lust get in the way. There's no other word for it. It was lust. And I wound up pregnant. Now, it didn't upset Larry because his whole goal was to be married anyhow. But for me, it was shame. It was disappointment. It was no big wedding. It was not all the usual things that little girls dream of. Nonetheless, we were married in the fall of 1958. And I learned to stuff those feelings. Like I say, he was ecstatic, and I was just happy that I was a wife and going to be a mommy. So in time, Larry and I shared 62 years of marriage. And in that time, we had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, who are sitting over yonder. Larry, I never gave it thought that sin would follow us throughout our entire lives. And even though I know God has forgiven me, it took me a long time to forgive myself. And there are still times when still it goes through my head. You knew it was wrong. Why did you do it? Anyhow, we started married life then, and we were happy. We attended church sometimes, not all the time, but we did consider ourselves Christian. I guess I always thought that my good works were going to outweigh my bad works, so I did not see that I needed to do what he said to be saved. And Larry had been saved when he was 15, before I had met him, at a big revival in downtown Baltimore. And so he knew what it meant to have Jesus in his heart. But he did not grow at all. If anything, he was going in the opposite direction. So, like I say, we didn't attend church all the time, but still, most of the time it was the kids and I doing things. I wound up in leadership in the Bible schools, in Sunday schools, in the United Methodist Women, in all of those different areas that I guess we all did in those days. Never heard an altar call given when the preacher was preaching. He had a good message, but it was more of good works type messages. Again, my pride kept me from realizing that I truly was a sinner. It just did not connect with me. Nonetheless, I guess it was around 1972 that I was becoming burnt out with church activities. If you know what I mean when I say I was doing church work, but not the work of the church, there's a big difference. So in 1972, we bought a house in Virginia on the Eastern Shore, which is down from that little peninsula, down from Salisbury, Maryland. Larry wanted a big garden. He wanted to be able to fish. We wanted the kids to have more room to just be out in God's world, in the nature, because our home in Baltimore had a very small backyard and the front yard was almost non-existent. So nonetheless, we decided that we would become what they call summer people. And each summer when school was out, the kids and I would go to Bloxham. Larry would work, keep most of his vacations for weekends, and then we enjoyed life down on the shore. The following summer in 1973, Larry was standing working on a window. He and Doug were putting in new windows in the house, I think, or something with them. And all of a sudden, something hit him in the side. It was really his right side. And he went down on the ground, all 250 pounds of him. Didn't know what it was. It looked like a pinprick. Did not bleed, but I don't even know, a bit, a trickle maybe, but I don't even know if it was that much. Nonetheless, he knew something was wrong, but we didn't know what. I took him to the local doctor. He x-rayed it, and he basically just kind of brushed it off with, oh, come on, it looks like a bee sting. There's nothing wrong with you. And the x-ray at that point did not show anything. So that was on a Monday. We went home and we continued doing the things that we normally would do. He still had went out fishing. He still had done some work in the garden. But I knew something was wrong. I knew he was in a lot of pain. He just never admitted it. And he was always a person that could deal with a pain level probably at a 9 or a 10, where mine is always way lower than that. But he didn't want to give in to, okay, something really is wrong. The doctor said it's nothing. But nonetheless, on Thursday night or Friday morning, that time frame, he woke me up and said, okay, Mill, it's time to go to the hospital. So I said, okay, you get in the car. I will go tell the kids what's happening. So I went up to their bedrooms, awoke them up, and told them what was going on, and we prayed together, and I said, I'll be back as soon as I can. So I drove 40 miles to the hospital, a local hospital on the shore. It was not a great big hospital. But as it happened, and it wasn't really anything but God's hand, a surgeon was already there at the hospital in the middle of the night. That doesn't happen. That's God. And the surgeon looked at Larry and said, something's in there, and it's got to come out. So I, of course, was in the waiting room, and he was in the back with Larry. And the surgeon said to Larry, you better make your peace with your maker, because I'm not sure I can save you. Of course, Larry knew what that meant. But he also said to the doctor, you can't tell my wife that. So they must have argued a little back and forth, and they agreed that the doctor told me Larry had a 50-50 chance of pulling through. In hindsight, I can say I never thought Larry was going to die. I mean, even 50-50 did not register. But again, you can imagine how my brain was flying in directions. I said to the doctor, do I have time to drive home and tell my kids? Again, this was before landline phones and they had some landlines, but we didn't. Cell phones, they were non-existent. So I drove home, I told the kids we had prayer again, and I headed back to the hospital, which I was there in plenty of time till the surgery was over. As it turns out, there was a piece of rusty wire about 2 inches long that had went into his side straight, went straight through organs, but didn't tear them up in any way. And it was on the x-ray standing right on an angle in front of his backbone. So this was abdominal surgery. From one side to the other, his tummy was opened up. I know I'm moving the mic. I'm sorry, guys. Yes, I'm with you.
No hurry, Melanie.
I know. I just need to.
And I know you had mentioned in the first service, at that time, your kids, the oldest was 13,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Went from 13,
11,
11,
10,
10,
and 9.
and 9.
They were all young. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, not a problem.
My sister came down to take care of the kids because they really were too young to be by themselves. And as they have many stories of what they did when I wasn't there, but, again, we don't talk about those too much, do we, guys?
So kids in the 50s weren't completely well behaved.
No.
All right, gives me some hope.
No.
Gives me some hope.
Especially brothers and sisters that like to tease each other.
I know the feeling.
So, yes, because you have two.
Oh, yeah.
I have 4, I mean.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyhow, Larry was in the hospital for 3 weeks. Now, when the doctor had opened him up, he found a lot of infection, gangrene, and peritonitis. If any of you are familiar with those terms, you know none of that is good. But nonetheless, the doctor did the best that he could, and he, closed the wound up, and Larry began to heal. Now, I have to say that during that time was when our first friends and neighbors right in this little town of Bloxham became exactly what we needed. I have no doubt that God sent them to us. 2 of the lay men, I think, were at the bedside the first day when Larry came back from the surgery because they had heard about us, and again, that's another long story, of being there. And they visited. Now, the pastor, because he was at Duke Seminary in the summer 4 weeks in a row, he was not there right then because this was early June. And so the lay people continued to visit. They brought us vegetables from their garden. They offered to take me to the store or any place else I wanted to go. They had even said, if my sister wanted a break, they would stay there with the kids while I was with Larry at the hospital. So nonetheless, when the pastor came back, he also joined in doing everything that we needed. We needed the support of people because we did not know anything. This was only our second summer down there. And because I was burnt out on church, we had decided it was a summer off. So we didn't do that, of course. When Larry got better, strong enough, because he was always a fighter. So as soon as he physically was able, he was up on his feet, and we started going to church. And so that was the beginning of a long history of attending Guilford United Methodist Church in the little town of Bloxham, Virginia. It is still there, and we still visit when we go back. It is a very, very small congregation. Nonetheless, they were exactly what God knew that we needed. And again, that is that example of God's faithfulness. Now, God was in control of all this because during the time we were summer people, Larry rededicated himself to the Lord. The 4 children came to know Jesus as their Savior. And I finally swallowed my pride and asked Jesus into my heart. Now, I had shared that much of my story with the kids back when I first knew I was going to do this. And I wanted to make sure I remembered it pretty well. And they had agreed with it, but the thing that they said, and it was Doug that really said it the most, he said, Mom, you have left out so much stuff that happened to Larry, to Dad, that you can't leave out because that's a whole part of the story. And so I thought about it, and we had a few additions that we added then to the story. When Larry was 12, his appendix had ruptured. So that was the first time he had gangrene, peritonitis infections. He had it then in the summer of 72. And then because of the surgery being all the way across his tummy, he had an incisional hernia, which meant he needed more surgery to correct it. So another surgeon did that and said that the wound had to stay open so it would heal from the inside out. But again, the peritonitis had showed up. And the doctors kept saying, this never happens. This never happens for peritonitis to live that long in somebody's body. Again, God, no other explanation. I well know that during so many of the times at nighttime when Larry was still in the hospital, when I would go to bed, go to sleep, I would be saying to myself, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, Philippians 4:13. It's been one of my favorite verses for many, many a year, and I guess that was part of pulling myself up on my own bootstraps, even though it wasn't. But it was telling myself, I can do this, I can do this. I can take care of Larry, I can take care of the kids. I also, though, because the kids didn't know I was doing all this at nighttime because they were in their beds asleep, and I also was singing What a Friend We Have in Jesus because it brought me comfort and I went to sleep. So again, the words were bringing me comfort. So by the time Larry had the second surgery, I've jumped two things ahead, or my papers are out of order. They are. My papers are out of order. Forgive me.
That's all right.
I had numbered them. I was smart enough to do that.
Let me give you a hand
3,
here.
4, 5.
Another hand always helps, right?
And where is 6?
There, right there. You got it right in front of you.
Okay, so I've done 6. I need 7.
Okay. Here, let's put 5 behind. There's 7. Here we go.
Okay, thank you. You're right, Doug.
There we go. Yep.
I was looking and it wasn't there.
Yeah. It has returned.
My crib sheets.
Yeah.
Larry had the second surgery, and we still went to Virginia. The doctor had said that would be okay. So we had went down to Virginia as usual, and one morning he was pulling out of our driveway to go to the doctor in Baltimore when a garbage truck with the tines down came barreling down the street. It hit Larry's Jeep on the passenger side and carried him across the gully and landed in our front yard. By the time I got across the driveway, Larry was sitting behind the driver's seat on the floor. His open tummy wound had no bleeding, no bruises, no bumps. His head was fine. He knew who he was. And it was like, oh. So he got out of the Jeep. We called the pastor immediately, and he came and had prayer with us. And the kids and I, of course, we settled down. But as soon as Larry calmed his own spirits, he said, well, I really still need to meet that doctor's appointment. So he took our other car, and he drove to Baltimore to see the doctor. Because he was in Baltimore still, he spent that night at our home in Baltimore. The middle of the night, he was awoken by a light, super bright, like these lights here. And he heard a voice saying to him, "This is the speed that I am coming. Are you ready?" Larry knew he wasn't. Nonetheless, he knew he would have to do something about that. And he did firmly believe that if he came to know the Lord, that his whole family would. And that goes back to the jailer back in the book of Acts, if you want to look it up and read it. But he believed that. So he knew that he needed to get his life straight. So, of course, by the time he got back down in Virginia and he shared that experience with all of us, of course, we were all totally like, wow, you know. So later that summer is when the kids all accepted the Lord at 9, 10, 11. No, I guess by then it was 10, 11, 12, and 14. But they accepted the Lord as their Savior. And they continued to grow, and they still continue to grow as Christians. The best thing is they're teaching their children, our great-grandchildren, my grandchildren, how to have a relationship with Jesus, that it's not all in the head. And eventually, I came to know the Lord, but I took a little longer. Larry and I had went down in the winter. It was in February, I remember distinctly. It was he and I, and we had went to church in the morning, and at that time, I answered the altar call and let Jesus in my heart. Wow. He moved from here to here. Sad to say, I was 35 years old. You know, it's like, why did it take me so long? Why was I so hard-headed? There is no answer. There is no answer.
But God's patience.
Yes, always, always. The biggest thing, the realization that I was a sinner came in one of the times before when we were driving out of our road onto the highway to head home in Baltimore. I looked out the passenger side of the car, and I saw a man lying in the street. And of course, I immediately thought he was drunk. I knew I'd never seen anybody in the street there at that intersection before. And I thought to myself, you know, okay, I guess he's drunk. But in my head, a voice said to me, "Mill, you are just as much a sinner as he is." I think that's when the realization hit. I know I cried the rest of the way home, just kind of those quiet tears, because that's more what I do than sobby tears. But I knew at that point that I had to ask Jesus in my heart. And so it was after that vision or that man and whatever, because nobody else ever saw him but me. I knew that I needed to. And so that's when I was 35 years old and asked Jesus in my heart. Okay, that time I said yes to Jesus, a second time. Now, from then, that was 1975, until now, there are many stories that I could tell you as to how I got from there to here. So I'm just going to jump a little ahead, because I know the time element, this is getting long. I was longer than I should have been this morning, Mark. I know it. See, this is my knowing right from wrong.
Well, I'm also trying to ask somebody to sum up 83 years of life in a half an hour. So,
yes.
I think
am I allowed?
There's grace. There's plenty of grace.
Thank you, Jesus. So, it was the summer of 2020, and COVID was in full force. And Larry and I, at that point, our church services were being held in the church parking lot and over a microphone, and all of us folks were in the cars, but we could hear the preaching in our cars. And Larry and I had went to church on a Sunday morning. We came home, did our usual thing, and as I often said, Larry was big on ice cream, which our whole family is. And,
Preacher.
Yep. Oh, yes. And so we had our ice cream. We, did a few things, probably watched a Western on TV. We went to bed, gave each other a kiss, turned to our side of the bed. And around 2 a.m., he woke up with a tremendous headache. He had always dealt with migraines, so in some ways it was like, okay, but it was way more pain than he had ever felt. He felt like his head was going to blow apart. And I, of course, called the paramedics. I was afraid he was going to roll off the bed on the floor because he was that agitated from the pain. The paramedics came, and I truly know that Larry was with Jesus before he ever left our bedroom, because his body had totally stilled, and I know at that point his brain was dead. He had had a cerebral hemorrhage. And like I say, I knew he was with Jesus. So what more could you ask but to be with your family, with your friends, one day feeling halfway decent, and the next few hours you're with Jesus? Hey, I would pray he would take me that way too. Nonetheless, Larry's heart continued to beat for another 8 hours. I followed the ambulance to the hospital, and because we both had living wills, which I still have, we did not basically do anything in the way of medical treatment other than make him comfortable. I knew that the brain was dead, but that his hearing, I believed, was still valid. So I first had called our church for prayer, the pastor, and I called the kids. But then I sat with him during that time, and I prayed, I sang, I told him it was okay to go. I told him I would be okay, and then I would kind of chuckle and say, but I won't like it, because I often had told him that before. He would say, I'm going before you, Mill. And I'd say, I won't like that. So I continued to kind of say that, yes, through tears, through, just in some ways a sweet time. Nonetheless, I really did know where he was, and I knew I would see him again. So as I said, the kids all came down, and because it was COVID, and again, I still say this is God's thing, we had the whole week to do what we wanted ourselves. I had asked our church friends not to visit, etc., even with masks and that sort of thing, to give us that week, and they all graciously did. So we had that whole week that we laughed and we cried, we shared, we ate all of Larry's favorite foods and lots of ice cream. I don't know how many containers we went through, but anyhow, you can kind of look at us all except our aim. But we just enjoyed being together. By the Saturday of that week, because Larry was cremated, and the kids knew that's what we had decided, and they were okay with cremation, we were able to spread his ashes at a favorite place, Camp Alcoholic on the shore. It's right on the water. And because, again, summer camp, the kids weren't there. They had canceled all of the camping for the week. So we were able to spread ashes over the water, and then we came back, and in our backyard, we were able to spread ashes. And each of us were able to sprinkle them in areas that were special to Larry, to me, to them, by his tractor, by the garden areas, by the duck house, by the bluebird houses that he had built. Just so many places that were important in our lives, and they knew were important to their dad. So it was a wonderful time. And then by Sunday evening, they were all back in their homes where they needed to be with their families. Now, I had never lived by myself before. I went from home to nurses training to being married. So I had never experienced being by myself. It was a big house, and I loved it. I was telling the kids, the same as Larry had always said, I'm staying here till I die, because I don't want to be anywhere else. We had retired there full-time in 92. So Larry and I had from 92 until 2020, when he died, there together. Many good years of retirement. But in the same sense, I know how hard grieving is. And while I was really content being there by myself, because I wasn't lonely, I had my friends, my church, I drove, it still was hard. I didn't like going to bed by myself. And again, I look out here and I can see many faces that have done the same thing, grieving for spouses and for parents grieving as well, or children. Grieving is not easy. It takes a long, long time, and sometimes almost forever, and that's okay too. But anyhow, I knew that God was with me, but I also knew that I needed to move closer to the children. As I was asleep one night, I had a dream. And this was not long, maybe even, it might have even been 6 months or so after Larry had died. I had this dream, and in the dream, Larry was there, and he was telling me, I love you, Mill, and it'll be okay. You'll do fine. I love you. I know also that it was Larry saying it, the same as I knew when God spoke, because the word Mill was said. And Larry was the only one, other than God, that called me Mill. Everybody else always called me Millie. And so I knew it was Larry just giving me the assurance that I needed to move on. I needed to be closer to the children. So after almost 62 years of marriage, I decided to pack up and move. That was a harder move than when he died, only because I was moving from a little sheltered rural community to Gaithersburg. And it was a totally new place. And that's how I ended up at Asbury Methodist Village. And I'm thankful to see my friend Pat there today, whom I've met at Asbury, and many others. Nonetheless, it was the right thing to do. And I knew that I needed to move closer because, let's face it, at 83 years, how long is my health going to stay halfway decent? And I wanted to know that, and Larry wanted to know that I would be cared for. We always felt it was selfish to want to move into their homes because at the ages they are now is when we wanted them to visit grandchildren and visit and do traveling and do whatever they wanted to do, because that's what Larry and I did when we were in our 60s. I hate to say that for their ages, but yes, nonetheless. So now Doug and Lynn, raise your hands, live in Buchanan, West Virginia, which is 4.5 hours away. Susie, our widow, lives in Sykesville, which is 50 minutes away. And Amy and Alex, they're saying, I don't want to do this. They are also in Sykesville, which is the same. And then Jeff and Laura are right around the corner in Durwood. So again, as Laura was looking, she recognized, and Laura has taught your daughter, she tells me, yes. Laura teaches around the corner at Sandy Grove Middle School. So nonetheless, I am here because of God's faithfulness. I am here because of Larry's love, of God's love. I know that everything I have is a gift. There's no way I earned any of it. It's a gift from God and from Larry. 3 things, as I say, or one first and then 3. See, I'm looking at notes. I said my last yes recently, maybe not recently, but anyhow, here at Neighborhood Church when I was joined into membership, I think it was, I don't know, at beginning of the summer, end of summer, maybe even last winter. Many more yeses have been said through Mark's preaching, through soul care, through just the life that you all here have at Neighborhood Church. And I surely pray that you know what you are getting. You are blessed. As I said one time, Neighborhood Church truly is a gem, and I have felt that way from the first time I walked through these doors. So never underestimate what you do as a congregation. Susan shared about the farmers market and how many of the folks working there are lay people. It was the lay people and Reverend Miller's preaching in Virginia that brought all of us to know Jesus. The lay people played a prominent part in that. So again, never underestimate the things that you do and think, oh, it doesn't matter, or nobody, sees that. People see, and our prayer is that they see Jesus in us, because that has always been my prayer, now that he's here. The 2 other things I would say, and this is for you married couples. Some of you may be early on in your married life, others farther along, the middle, at the end. But if you are not praying out loud with each other every day, doing devotions together, you are truly missing blessings that God will give you. You will grow in your own relationship with Jesus. You will grow in your relationship with each other, and that'll spill right over to your kids. So that would be my first request that you do. And my second is aimed at young people, young children, young adults, anyone that's not married. Leave sex for marriage. There's no other way to say it.
Preach it.
Yes. Preach it is right. Because Larry and I dealt with that our whole life. Definitely, I know I did more than he, but in the same sense, that's because we didn't learn to communicate early on. But it's important. And so just leave that to God, because that is what God intended. He did not intend for it to happen before you were married. So I thank you for listening, and Amen. I can't say any more other than if you want to know something, ask me. I will tell you.
Thank you, Millie. Give her a hand. Thank you. If the worship team wants to come up, come on up here. I'm going to encourage you. I hope you heard God's faithfulness in Millie's life through generations of how God has been at work. And my prayer for you is that you walk out here today and you look at your own life, whatever season you're in. If you're in the middle of a season that's difficult, if you're in the middle of a season of blessing, whatever season that you're in, that you would be reminded of God's faithfulness throughout all generations. that whatever's happening, that you'd see God's faithfulness. Let's say a prayer. Father God, I thank you so much for Millie's story. I thank you so much for how you have been at work. And I pray, God, for your continued work in her life, in this church, and in our own lives. May we see your faithfulness. In Jesus' name, amen.